chat for any questions as we go, but we should have enough time. Chris will give us at least 15 minutes of Q&A. So thank you all for joining, and we'll start in about a minute and a half.
The other Chris, not Chris Walls.
That's right. Walnut Radio, Chris Walls. No, we're going to do his presentation later on.
I will be on the 3-putt 6 holes yesterday.
Well, I thought he was supposed to take over for me halfway through. You know, I mean, this was going to be a joint thing, and I would just leave. You know, so.
That sounds awesome. All right, folks. My name's Gary Clark, and it is a pleasure with the Greater Fremont Development Council to provide you with a presentation from Chris Kuehl, who is from Armada Corporate Intelligence, and Chris is actually the managing director. Chris, I won't go into your lengthy and illustrious bio.
Thank you.
I'm just going to let you take the lead here.
Very good. I appreciate that, because I've always been made aware of the fact that the favorite definition of an expert is a former drip under pressure. So I don't really want to set myself up for lofty expectations. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on with this viral epidemic, and I promise that I am not going to try to impersonate a doctor. There have been a plethora of people who have suddenly become viral epidemiological experts, despite the fact that prior to that, they weren't even able to spell epidemiological. So I'm going to stick to what I know, which is the economic impact, and we're going to refer to some of the issues around the virus itself, but I'll kind of leave that to others with better information than I. We have been describing this from the very beginning as a black swan event. This is something that we picked up as economists from the philosophical community probably 15, 20 years ago. And what a black swan event refers to is something that is unexpected but expected. So we knew that we were going to get hit by a viral epidemic of some kind, because we have been literally almost every year for the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years. I mean, we've been dealing with Marburg and Ebola and swine flu and avian flu and SARS and MERS and Zika, and it just goes on and on. We've had these consistently. What we don't know whenever we're hit by one of these is when exactly they're going to manifest, how they're going to manifest, what they're going to look like when we get them, and what exactly we're supposed to do about it. So the challenge for any of these is to be prepared for something that you can't completely prepare for. And as we were getting into the whole conversation about what do we do about COVID-19, we knew right from the start that we were operating at a deficit. We weren't in a position to adequately test. We didn't have enough testing. We didn't know quite what we were testing for. That's still kind of a challenge. We didn't have the ability to track and trace, which is still kind of a challenge. We didn't really have a treatment, though that is not unusual for viral infections. Most of the time, treatment is literally just helping the body get through the disease and letting the body do its own thing. I mean, that's what we do with the flu every year, is we just try to keep people intact while they fight off the flu. And that's similar to what we've been trying to do with COVID-19. I mean, remember, this is a coronavirus, of which there are thousands. I mean, every common cold, every flu, they're all coronavirus. This is a particular kind, one that we had not seen until now. So all we were really left with as far as a response was some kind of isolation, some kind of separation of people to slow down the spread of the disease. We have kind of forgotten in the last couple of months what the real motivation for that was. There was never an expectation that we were going to be able to defeat the virus simply through isolation, because sooner or later, people have to come in contact with one another, one way or the other. And so there's no way that you completely quarantine an entire global population. The idea was to slow it down enough that it would not overwhelm the medical sector, so that as people were needing help, respirators and the kind of therapy that is required to get past this, that we would have enough beds, we would have enough hospitals. So the whole idea from the very beginning was just to slow it down. And something we'll talk about kind of towards the end of this is that the ultimate solution, which is not particularly fun to talk about, is herd immunity. It gets to a point that we are with the flu every year where enough people have been infected and therefore have some form of temporary immunity that it doesn't spread like it was in the beginning. That's what happens with flu vaccines every year. What happens, and again, people sort of know this, but sort of forget, when you get a vaccine, you are being given the flu. You are being given a dead version of the flu. The idea is to trick the body into thinking that it is fighting the flu, and it produces antibodies to do that. Next time you get hit by the real flu, your body has already built the antibodies. It already thinks it's ready to fight it, and you have a either much reduced version of the flu or you don't get it at all. That's kind of the general idea, and that is the extent of my medical knowledge. We are now dealing with some of the political issues, and that's going to play a role really through the rest of the year and likely into 2021. There has been a fairly intense partisan divide over which of the two issues to deal with first. We both have an economic crisis in the lockdown, and we have a health crisis with the epidemic. And as we'll talk about in a minute, nothing that you do solves both of the issues at the same time. Anything you do to address one makes the other more of a challenge. We have definitely seen a power shift to the governors and to states, not really too surprising from a business perspective. I mean, businesses are well aware that there's influence that comes from the federal level, but most of what determines what they do is state level. You know, it's the state that works on workforce development. It's the state that develops infrastructure. It's the state that has zoning laws. It's the state that does the majority of the sort of support work for business development. And, you know, that's why you have organizations like Fremont Economic Development, because that's the more local the support, the more appropriate it is for a business. And that's one of the reasons that this epidemic has become a matter of governor's responsibility more than a national. There really is no national policy when it comes to reopening. There are 50 state versions, compounded by the fact that within each state, every city is doing something differently. I mean, I'm from Kansas City. Many of you remember that when I was visiting up in Fremont. We split right down the middle. I mean, half of us are on the Missouri side, half on the Kansas side. Both states have different systems in place for reopening. And then you have different systems for the counties and different systems for the city. At one point, there were 14 different dates as far as opening up business in the Kansas City area. So as businesses were trying to figure out what to do, it's like, okay, what's your address? Okay, well, the guys across the street can open, you can't. You can only open on Tuesdays, but only unless there are people wearing red. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and it gets very confusing. It's an election year, we know that. And we know that this will play a role by the time the elections roll around. But the pattern for election years is always pretty much the same. You've got a third of the voters now who already are going to support Trump no matter what. You've got a third that will oppose Trump no matter what. They made their decisions a year or two or three ago, and they have not changed them one iota. The campaigns will literally focus exclusively on that crucial last third. They will not make up their minds until about 2 seconds before they walk into the voting booth. And traditionally, it's economics that has that impact. If they are feeling good about where they are at the 1st of November, the economy is recovering, they got their jobs back, everything is great, they're going to reward the incumbents. They're going to vote for the governors, representatives, senators, presidents, mayors, whoever was in power, because they will reward them for having gotten them through this crisis. If they are not feeling good at the beginning of November, they will take the position that the incumbents blew it, and they're going to vote for their opposition and will vote for the new governors and new representatives, new senators, new president, new whatever, because they're mad at the people who got them into that position. That has been going on for a century. It's not that new. We've seen a greatly expanded role for government, and that is something that's going to be under discussion for a long time. There's been a lot of attempts to try to stimulate the economy. We'll talk a little bit about why it's not been as effective as we'd hoped it would be. But going forward, we're now looking at a debt and deficit situation that is really out of control. Economists have been like Cassandra out in the wilderness, just screaming for 20 years, you had better do something about the debt and deficit because sooner or later you're going to need the money. And now we need the money, and all we can do is borrow more. So we'll talk about that obsession later. And there's also been an issue of trust gap. We're confused as consumers because we're getting lots of different messages. We're getting people that really emphasize the economic part, and we have people that are emphasizing the medical part and everything in between. These issues are going to be big as far as the election is concerned. It kind of depends on how serious the economy question is by then, but there'll be questions like, should there have been a lockdown at all? Should the lockdown have been more aggressive? What could we have done to prepare for this? What should we do to prepare for the future? Should there be more money in public health? And if so, for what? And what do we do about the debt and deficit now? Is there anything we need to do now by the end of the year to get the economy back on track? And bigger questions such as what relationship should we have with countries like China going forward? In the very beginning, China was being desperately unhelpful. They were doing with this issue November, December of last year. They were hiding it, particularly the local authorities in Hubei and Wuhan. They didn't want the central government to know. And by the time the central government did find out that was purge, most of the people in Wuhan were relieved of their jobs, if not their freedom. And China continued to be unhelpful and didn't release a lot of information. So we might have had a little bit more of an opportunity to control the virus if there had not been that kind of obfuscation, but that's kind of a moot point now. The data that's coming out of China now, we can be a little more confident in because China has been essentially overrun by international health authorities. So 2 or 3 months ago, all the data was coming from China itself. Now it's coming from WHO, CDC, Japanese Health Ministry, European Health Ministry. Financial Times reported that there are no less than 126 national health authorities active in China right now, because every country in the world is looking at that as the epicenter and trying to figure out what they do from here. So here is the whole issue in one slide. It's a trade-off. There is nothing that can be done that's going to address both issues at the same time. The only thing we have left to deal with the virus is containment of some kind or another. Containment simply means trying to keep people away from each other, which means shutting down everything, shutting down businesses, shutting down events, shutting down any opportunity for people to interact. Anything you do to accelerate the containment process hurts the economy. The economy is obviously in dire straits. Every set of numbers that comes out is as miserable as it has been in decades, and it's hitting certain parts of the population much harder than others. Anyone who's been involved in the service sector, that's one of the reasons that, unlike most recessions, this one has hit women harder than men. Usually it's the other way around. If you go back to 2008, the sector that was hit the hardest were men with less than college education. Now it's women with less than college education because they are the ones that were working and are depending on the service sector. So that's the problem for a politician. There is no good solution. Anything you do is going to make one of the other problems worse. Couple of things to put this in context. This is still not as bad as the recession we had in 2008. And the reason for that, I mean, obviously the numbers are much worse. I mean, the deterioration in second quarter is just legendary, but we haven't had the quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter decline. You go back to 2008, I mean, that was a solid year of negative numbers. That was not a recession. That was getting into depression territory. And we continued to suffer years afterwards. I mean, we were still hitting negative quarters in 2010 and 2011 and 2012. It wasn't until about 2016 that you could really declare that the impact of the 2008 recession had been spent. So this one still has the potential to be one of those short, sharp, damaging but recoverable recessions. The one that we really want to avoid is that repeat of 2008. That's a checkmark recession. That's an L recession. It takes forever to come back from, and the damage that's done is near permanent. Lots of different scenarios depending on how fast things recover. I mean, best case is a complete recovery, probably not likely in 2020. But if you get a fast recovery relatively, things begin to come back to normal in May and June, things don't look terrible. You know, the US is back to the kind of growth it had before the COVID crisis began. If the cure and the response is delayed, we're not going to get it until late summer, early fall. Things don't look particularly good, but not, again, awful. I mean, the US is going from 1.7 to 1.5. I mean, it's not the right direction, but it is not like it's dropping out of sight. The profound recession option, which right now is not the least likely or not the most likely, is the one that drops us into negative territory for a year or longer. This is a deliberately confusing slide, which is just designed to show you that it's affecting everything. This is a global recession, and often recessions are not global. There is often a country or two or three that is emerging out of it in better shape and sort of becomes the engine for the rest of the world to recover. There's no engine this time. We don't have any part of the world that has been unaffected. So it's not the US pulling things out. It's not going to be China pulling the economy along. It's not Europe. It's nobody. We're all going to be waiting to see how this plays out more or less together. And not necessarily a bad situation, but it's helpful when there is a country that is in a position to sort of lead the charge. We might see the Asian nations becoming a little more aggressive because they're coming out of this a little faster than Europe and the US because they were hit earlier. But that difference is minor. It's a few weeks rather than a few months. So here's the two good news slides. I mean, you know, there's not a lot of good news around these days, but these are the projections. This is what's coming from the European Union itself. Obviously, 2019 was not a banner year. That's a pre-COVID year, but it was anemic, and Europe had been dealing with anemic growth for a long time. 1.2% growth is pretty crummy. Everyone agrees that 2020 is going to be a mess. We're talking about a decline of over 7% in Europe, which is pretty catastrophic. But look at 2021. 2021 is looking at growth that is 3 times what it was in 2019. Europe has not seen that kind of growth in 20 years. And the rationale behind this projection is simply twofold. One is that there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand. Consumers are going to be anxious to get back to the life they left before. But more importantly, if it is indeed a V-shaped recession, it will do what V-shaped recessions do. It purges the economy of poorly performing companies that then open up market share for the better performing companies. And the better performing companies grow, hire people, expand, etc., and drive the economy forward. So this is a pretty optimistic assessment on the part of the Europeans. What's even more amazing is what the IMF comes up with. Understand that the International Monetary Fund puts the dismal in the dismal science. These people are not optimists. Every year you get the World Economic Outlook from the IMF, and it is depressing. It is always, always lower than almost everyone else is predicting. So to have the IMF come forward with an outlook that says US growth in 2021 is 4.7%, we have not hit numbers like that in well over 15 years. The European Union has not hit numbers like that for 20 years. This is a projection that shows the entire world bouncing back at a dramatic pace. Now, part of that is related to the fact that the previous year base is going to be very low. So coming back from a decline of 6 points or 7 points, it leaves you a lot of latitude and you can come back up pretty strongly. But they are also counting on this V-shaped behavior that you get pent up demand, things get back to normal in a relatively short period of time, and you have that purgative impact that the companies that were on their last legs go ahead and disappear. And those that recover are therefore stronger. They have better market share. Doesn't always work that way, and that transition is painful. I mean, there's a lot of people that work for those companies that are struggling, and then suddenly they're having to reinvent themselves. But with all the gloom and doom that we've been hearing about the economy lately, because I mean, this is the month, April and May, that we are going to see the worst numbers. Industrial production numbers came out today, and it's like, oh my God, down 12%, retail down 8%. I mean, these are unprecedented falls. And one of my new goals in life is to go through a 24-hour period without using the word unprecedented. It's like I'm just, normal would be nice. Even though we get a big recovery, it's going to drag the economy down for a while because companies are going to take some time to recover from the damage. Certainly consumers will. There's pent up demand. People are going to go back into the retail community and spend, but they can't help but have been affected by not having an income for 2 months or longer. So, and this goes to the issue of why the stimulus has not been as effective as we'd hoped it would be. The stimulus that is introduced during any recession is similar. It's all based on the idea of getting as much money as you possibly can into the hands of the consumer through tax cuts, through direct payments, expanded unemployment, any particular system you can think of. And the idea is to get people out there spending because we are an economy that is run by our consumers. The problem this time has been that the consumer has gotten money. There's been assistance, not in every place that it's needed, but there's been a lot of money thrown into this. I mean, we're looking now at something close to 4 trillion. Congress is talking another 3 trillion. The problem is there's no place for the consumers to spend it. Traditionally, Americans don't save. We have a very low savings rate. Year after year, 4%, 5%. Occasionally we get up as high as 6. Some years we dissave. We literally spend more money than we make. Right now, the savings rate in the US is 24%. We have never been at 24%, but if you're getting money and there's nothing open, what do you do with it? You know, I mean, you can only buy so many hundred of rolls of toilet paper, and the vast majority of what we spend our money on as consumers are services. That is the majority of our discretionary income, and it is cut off. So until that opens up, that money just sort of, and we assume the consumers go back, then that money will get spent and the stimulative principles will be in place. But at the moment, it's just kind of sitting there being idle. We've heard a lot about oil, and it's important to understand again that we've not necessarily plowed new ground. We've seen a 56% decline over 7 months, and that's, you know, COVID-19 hasn't been an issue for 7 months. This was a decline that began at the end of last year. But we had a 54% decline in 2014. Why? No particular reason, just prices fell. There demand issues, and there was overproduction issues, and so oil has done this a lot. If you look at the history going back to the 80s, I mean, it's had spikes, it's had declines. These are not the lowest points that oil has reached, and oil tends to come bouncing back when the conditions change. This is what you get with a good that has inelastic demand. The fact of the matter is people use oil, use gas, use fuel for purposes. It's not like they change their behavior with the price. They complain about it. I mean, if the price of gas goes up to $3.50 or $4 or higher, people don't like it and they object. Do they change their behavior? No. How could they? It's like, by God, gasoline is $4 a gallon. I'm never going to work again. It's too expensive. I'm never going to drive to the grocery store again. I'm never going to go. I mean, of course you are. You're going to drive to work like you always do. You're going to go to the store like you always do. It's going to cost you more and you're going to be angry about it, but you're going to do it. By the same token, if the price of gasoline drops to where it is now, well, it's not like suddenly everybody in Fremont is saying, well, gas is really cheap. So from here on out, I am going to commute to Omaha via Sioux Falls. I'm going to drive through Minneapolis first, and then I'm going to go to Des Moines, and then I'm going to go down to Memphis, and then I'll eventually get to Omaha because it's cheap. No, you're just going to drive like you always do and be glad that the gas didn't cost that much. Oil is highly, highly, highly dependent on demand. And right now, demand is down. People aren't driving. Businesses are not operating. You're not seeing as much ocean traffic. Airline fuel consumption is about the same because the airlines are not required or are not allowed to stop flying. They have to continue to maintain those routes. So they're still using fuel. Not as much, but they're still using a lot. We saw the markets react and they went into hyperdrive for a while and then sort of began to bounce back. Couple things again to remember about what was going on prior to COVID. Everybody and their brother last year were talking about how overvalued the market was and how due for a correction it was. And a lot of the decline that hit when COVID hit was partly propelled by this notion that we were going to go into a decline anyway. So the speed with which it dropped was probably a reflection partly of worries about COVID and partly because we thought we were due for one of these anyway. What we have now seen is kind of a return to that normal volatility. It has dropped by a considerable percentage, down some 20%, but now is staying in that range and bouncing up and down the way it always does, according to whatever the latest rumor is. We're seeing a lot of changes in the workforce. Global workforce could lose somewhere in the vicinity of $3.4 trillion. Workforce is a consumer when they get home. So that's dragging $3.5 trillion out of the consumption pile. The employment situation could be rectified relatively quickly, but it's going to depend on kind of how consumers react and how businesses react. The majority of the jobs lost, probably 80 to 85%, would be better classified as furloughs. They're not really layoffs in the sense that the company, in many cases, flat told their workforce, look, we have been shut down. It's not like we stopped remembering how to do business. We were ordered to close. As soon as we get back to normal, we are rehiring you. We have to. I mean, if you're running a hotel and the hotel has been shut down, the day that the hotel opens, well, the manager isn't going to sit there and say, yep, I'm going to do it all myself. I'm going to make all the beds. I'm going to clean all the bathrooms. No, you hire that 500-person staff back that day. And so our hope is that as companies come back to life, they hire their workforces back. The critical question at this point is going to be, one, will the consumer come back and justify that investment? And two, will the workforce come back? And one of the things that companies are having to contend with is that, and they've always had to contend with this, roughly 20%, 25% of the workforce is what we would refer to as a transactional employee. Transactional employees are motivated by one thing and one thing only. How much are you paying me? They're the ones that have always been hard to retain, because if somebody across the street offers them 25 cents an hour more than you are, they're gone. It's like, hey, I'm going to get 25 cents more an hour. I'm never going to get any more money out of you. You know, I don't have that kind of job with your company. You're not going to promote me. You're not going to give me a raise. You're not going to provide benefits. You're not training me for new skills. I'm just doing a schlub job, and I'm going to get paid the same from you forever. So if I get a break, I'm going to leave. That's the group that is looking at the money they're getting from the government right now, saying, I don't need to go back to work because I'm getting more from unemployment and the extra payments that are being made than I would get if I went back to work. When those payments end, they're right back to work, but they're still transactional. They're still not sticky. Companies that have jobs that are sticky, where you stick with me, you're going to get raises, you're going to get promotions, we're going to train you, we've got benefit packages, those workers come back right away, because to them this job is future. It's something that they're vesting themselves in for a longer term. As I mentioned earlier, our spending is weighted towards services. So the things that have seen the biggest decline: health and beauty, entertainment, restaurants, transportation, shopping, travel, all of that is optional spending. It is all discretionary spending, and that makes it vulnerable. I mean, one of the challenges that businesses are having now is, under what circumstances are we allowed to reopen? If you're a restaurant, for example, and I've been hearing a lot of conversation about that because those have been opened up just recently in the Kansas City area, but with all kinds of rules. It's kind of like, you can open up, but people have to be separated by 10 feet, and the wait staff's going to be wearing masks and gloves, and people are not going to be allowed to wait around for a table, and so all of it makes a certain amount of sense, but it also hits the whole purpose of going to a restaurant. It's not for the food. It rarely is for the food. All of us know where a grocery store is. All of us can put something in a microwave. We're going to a restaurant because of the service and the experience, and it's fun and it's entertaining. When it begins to feel like going through a TSA checkpoint, then people are like, no, I don't want to do that. I'll just keep getting takeout and take it home and be able to enjoy my meal. There was one official here who was, I think, corrected at some point, because he said that he wanted patrons in the restaurant to wear their masks at all times. And I'm just kind of looking at him going, buddy, I don't know how you eat, but in my circle, most of us put the food in our mouth, which is really hard to do through a mask. So if you're suggesting that we take the mask on and off and on and off, that violates every protocol there is on using a mask, because you are not supposed to touch it with your hands, etc. So it's kind of like, please think this through just a little bit. And the businesses are concerned. They're like, I don't know if my consumers will come back under these circumstances. We'll find out. It's going to be, right now, the polls suggest that around 25% of people are so anxious to get back to their old lives that they'll put up with anything. 25% are still planning to bunker, and they don't trust what's happening, and they're still worried, and they're not going anywhere. And that leaves that 50% where are they? What are they thinking? This is a chart that you may not be familiar with, but it is coming from credit managers. I'm the economist for the National Association for Credit Management, and we track what's happening with trade credit. What this chart shows is a complete collapse in March and April. But the important thing was why. In our estimation with our chart, we separate the numbers into what we call favorable and unfavorable categories. Favorables are from the perspective of a credit manager. That would include sales, applications for credit, dollar collections, amount of credit extended. Then we have the unfavorables from a credit manager's perspective: collections, disputes, bankruptcies, slow pays, rejections of credit applications. All of the damage, all of which has created those two red lines, were in the favorables. Sales collapsed, applications collapsed, dollar collections collapsed. The unfavorables didn't change much. We didn't see an increase in collections. We didn't see an increase in disputes. We didn't see an increase in bankruptcies. There hasn't been enough time. If you had 90, 120, 180-day terms, you're not in collection territory until you're due to pay. And you're not due to pay until June, July, August, September. You won't be in collection territory until then. The credit managers are preparing for it, knowing that some of their companies are going to be in trouble, but there's time. So if we get a recovery in May or June, they may be in a position to keep current on their credit by the time it's due. At least that's the hope, because at the moment it's a delayed reaction, but delays can be helpful. Something else to worry about, just for you who are tired of worrying about COVID-19 and want to obsess about something else, are debt and deficits out of control. It was before, it really is now. We were predicting that by 2024, 25, debt service in this country would be equal to or bigger than the entire US military budget. That is now going to happen next year. Next year, we will have more paying out in debt service than we spend on the entire military. And that's not a good place to be. We are basically financing year after year a massive deficit. And this is certainly not going to help, because we are potentially dumping $6-7 trillion into the economy. Obviously, we have a reason to do that, but it certainly makes the debt and deficit issue critical. And we all know what happens if we ever do decide to deal with that. It means massive budget cuts, then it means more revenue, more taxes. And that's never a popular place for politicians to be. We know where the outbreaks are: heavy concentration in urban areas, areas where you have a larger vulnerable population. We know who is at risk. We know that it's mostly those who are over 60. Their fatality rate is over 13%. Those who are under 50, it's much less. Underlying health issues play a huge role, particularly if they're lung or immune related. But something that doesn't get discussed nearly as much, but has become a major factor, is issues of obesity and being out of shape and fatigue. Remember that part of this whole issue is the body fighting its own disease battle. So, as whether it's the flu or COVID-19 or the common cold, getting over any of these coronavirus attacks means the body and its antibody defense system kicks into gear and defeats the disease. If you are not in good shape, if you are not in peak condition, if you are worn out and tired, your body can't fight as effectively as it could if you were. So one of the sort of ongoing concerns is, like, if you want to protect yourself from stuff like this, get in shape and try not to run yourself ragged, because those are the two things that make you most vulnerable that you personally could do something about if you wanted to. So we'll end this with some scenarios. What happens from here? The most likely is that we'll get a series of serious outbreaks in specific areas, those with vulnerable populations. We'll see this in urban areas. We will see it in nursing homes. We will see it anywhere where the vulnerable are, to one degree or another, collected. The next most likely is that you would have waves of infection in areas where there has been a loosening of restrictions. People who were not exposed become infected, and as a result, it begins to spread again. The least likely is a massive second wave, like the one that started this. And the reason the massive second wave is not likely now is that we have a certain amount of herd immunity already. We have seen enough people get it, and enough people with at least temporary immunity, that it is slowing the infection rate down. We've now hit globally a circumstance where there have been more recoveries than there have been deaths. And that's the first time this has happened since the outbreak. The country that everybody is watching like a hawk when it comes to this is Sweden. Sweden decided from the very beginning to take a totally different approach. Their state epidemiologist basically said, look, the only thing that works is herd immunity. I mean, you can look it up. It's the only thing that ever works. I want to get there right now. I want to make sure that virtually everybody in Sweden gets this as soon as possible. We are not going to close anything. We're not going to close schools. We're not going to close stores. We're not going to close anything. We're going to try to be protective of people who are particularly vulnerable. You know, we'll watch the elderly and the like. But we're going to get to herd immunity as fast as possible, because when there is a second wave, you're all going to get affected by it. We're not. And that's begun to happen in Europe. Some of the other countries are getting that second wave. Sweden is like, we're not. We already have herd immunity. And the rest of you will get there someday, but you've wasted a lot of time and you've hurt your economy. The strongest economy in Europe right now is Sweden. And everybody is like, really? But you didn't used to be in that position. Yeah, well, you closed everything. We didn't. Winners and losers, we kind of know this already. You know, the potential winners, medical, communication, IT, we're all working from home now. Don't you wish you had invested in Zoom about this time, considering that everybody and their brother is Zooming? Things that have been affected, manufacturing, construction. There was a pre-question that was asked before I even started this about the housing market. We're still trying to figure out exactly how this is going to play out, but there are some trends that are beginning to emerge, at least in terms of the polls that are being taken by people in construction, in house construction, in particular the real estate market. There had been a real bias against single family homes in the millennial population. The millennials were the ones that were most interested in multifamily apartments, lost, and the like. That is suddenly shifting. And you're suddenly getting a lot of millennials going, you know, that suburban house with a moat and razor wire is beginning to sound like a really good idea. I don't think I want to be in multifamily anymore. The other thing that is beginning to get hit are nursing homes and senior living environments. People are all of a sudden say, no, I mean, this is where this stuff has been running rampant. I work a lot with home remodelers, and they said the number one request that has been coming in for the last month and a half are people saying, I need you to come out here and build an apartment in my house for my elderly parents. I am taking them out of the nursing home. I'm taking them out of that senior living facility and bringing them home. I don't want them exposed to this anymore. On the other hand, I need something for them to live in that is effective. So all of a sudden, they're getting all kinds of calls for, you need to retrofit my house so that it can handle my elderly parents. I need an intern apartment, etc. And they're also even getting requests from people saying, you know who else is moving back? My children. I did send them off to college, but now college is going to be virtual. So they're going to be sitting with me. So I need like a bunker for them, or, you know, some kind of cell, because I don't want to deal with my adult children any more than I have to. So we're going to hush at this point, take some questions. This is what the world looks like from different perspectives. Introverts are like, outstanding. I have planned my whole life for this. So they're very happy. Extroverts are convinced that it's all over and they're just going to die alone in their apartment and no one will ever know. The media thinks it's the zombie apocalypse and we're all going to be living in a barren wasteland, when we all know what it actually has become is fistfights over toilet paper. So this is kind of the world that we're anticipating. We're now going to take questions. If we don't get to yours, or if you don't think of one until later, feel free to email me. I am just as long-winded in print as I am in public. You can call me. We can talk it out over the phone. Many of you are already subscribers to the brief I do 3 days a week. It's free. Lately, I've been thinking of changing the name to the Plague Report, but at some point, I'll be writing about something other than COVID, I hope. So, questions?
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. That was awesome and great detail. I know I asked an initial question, but I'll allow the folks who are on here. It looks like we have at least 17 on the Zoom. And my first question that I thought of was the $1 trillion stimulus being proposed by the House. Your thoughts on that? And then the Federal Reserve Bank's plea by their lead person stating that there's a need for more relief. Do you agree? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it depends a whole lot on sort of how the recovery begins to play out, because all of the stimulus thus far has been very traditional, and it's what you do during a recession. It's putting money in people's pockets. That only works if they can spend it. Now, the assumption is that most of the states are going to be opening up this week, next week, and by the 1st of June. If indeed they do, and if indeed consumers get past the inconvenience and resume at least part of their old behavior, that's when the stimulus will do the most good, because you'll be putting money into people's hands and then they'll be spending it. This is really the most critical time for business, because when they were completely shut down, they weren't making any money, but they also weren't spending any. They weren't hiring people, they weren't buying supplies, they weren't paying utilities, whatever. Now they're doing all that. They've got their staff back and they're buying. So if they don't get business now, they're in big trouble because they're spending and not earning. So that's when the stimulus would kick in. The Fed's commentary has been fairly consistent, and what they're really trying to do is reassure people that even with this deficit and debt growing to astronomical levels, they are not going to start pulling back on their support. One of the most recent statements from a Fed official was Barkin, who's the Fed chief in Richmond, and his opinion, which is shared by several of the regional bank presidents, is that we've hit bottom, that this is the worst that it's going to be, and that we'll start to see a recovery coming into the remainder of the year. Barkin is joined by most of the other regional presidents in predicting that third quarter will actually show growth, fourth quarter will show growth. We'll still be trying to recover from what we lost in first and second, but it's still kind of a toss-up as to whether Congress will actually pass another major stimulus bill. Those who are hesitating kind of want to see what happens to the existing stimulus once business is open, because they know there's a lot of money out there that hasn't moved. When it, like for example, the PPP, a lot of companies have not applied for that because it's not quite solving their problems. I mean, it's basically you get this loan which you can not pay back if you keep your payroll. Well, a lot of companies are running into their employees saying, dude, please fire me because I get more money from the government right now than I'm getting from you. So even though I appreciate that you're trying to hang on to this, you're killing me. And so the companies are like, look, the best thing I can do for my employees right now is to go ahead and fire them so they can get this federal help and then hire them back when the conditions change. But if I've taken out this PPP loan, well, then I'm going to end up having to pay it back because I let my workforce go. So a lot of the provisions, the SBA is issuing new guidelines literally every day going, okay, we didn't mean that. And we didn't mean that either. Do that. No, that's not going to happen. We're familiar with this. I mean, it's always the way it works. Congress passes very large, complicated legislation, and then we figure out what it means.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, Chris, there's another question from Nathan. Nathan says, review why building up our debt and deficit is bad. I've been hearing about it my whole life, but no one seems to care. And here we are suddenly spending trillions and handing out free money. When and how will this begin to affect us negatively?
Yeah, we're in a very weird position, and it's very unique. Every other country in the world has to deal with its balance of payments, deficit, and debt with their hard currency. And that's one of the things that keeps them from going absolutely ballistic when it comes to debt and deficit. Hard currency is dollars. So whenever we run into that, we sort of print more. The Fed basically authorizes more sale of federal T-bills and treasury bonds. we are the most desired treasury bonds in the world. I mean, everyone who wants a secure investment, the United States is the place you buy your treasuries. So we always have the market. The economic challenge is not so much that we won't be able to raise the money or that we can't go any further into debt. It's that debt service issue. We're paying out $400 billion a year in debt service because as you sell those bonds, the people who bought them get a return, and they're going to be the ones that get taken care of first. Fortunately, sort of, most of the purchasing is the Fed itself. The Fed back in 2008 went from an $800 billion balance sheet to a $6 trillion balance sheet because they're the ones that bought most of that debt. They're doing it again, and their balance sheet's going to be very high again. So it doesn't really cripple us immediately, but it's the opportunity cost thing. Remember that from Economics 101. You spend 400 billion a year on debt service. Well, that's 400 billion you can't spend on anything else. So we are sitting there going, wow, if we just had 300 billion to put into infrastructure, we could fix everything. Well, you did have 300 billion for infrastructure, but you spent it on debt service. So that's the fear, and the only way to contend with it again is cutting some spending and taxing. Much of what is taking out the federal budget is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Hard to cut those. And other stuff has been pared back to the point where you can't get much more than that. So then you're talking taxes, except that every state and every city also has to raise taxes. And pretty soon the consumer is like, excuse me, can I keep any of my money? You know, a dollar or two, three maybe. So it's, yeah, it's a conundrum. We're not alone, you know, everyone in the world. If it makes you feel any better, our debt to GDP is like 110% of our GDP. It's 280% of GDP in Japan. So we're better off than Japan.
Right. Chris, one additional question I have is tied to local municipalities who are being hit by COVID financially, and states. Do you see states imploring that our federal government do more, or do you think they just want to open back up and leave it at that?
Yeah, and states are going to be in a real bind, and so will communities because their tax base, particularly cities, are so dependent on sales tax and property tax. And both of those have been hit, particularly sales tax. So a lot of jurisdictions are going to be faced with a very uncomfortable process. They're going to have to reduce their services because they haven't got the money to pay for it. And they're going to have to figure out a way to get some kind of revenue stream started up. You know, they're going to be counting on those sales taxes to come back, but they're also going to be looking really hard at anything that could be construed as a user fee. If you look around the world, various countries facing exactly the same issue have been trying to do things like more toll roads, more user fees for things that used to be free, getting more higher taxes for gasoline, you know, finding, because right now you're sitting there thinking, look, gas is $1.50 a gallon. This would be the time to raise the gas tax because people wouldn't even feel it. You know, you could add another dollar and people would be fine. That always works until the gas prices go back up. And then all of a sudden it's like, holy cow, you know, I mean, my gas is $5 a gallon because $2 of it is taxes. You know, so there's never an easy answer, but we're very likely to start having to re-examine the tax bases and trying to figure out exactly how to raise the money that we need for the services that we want. A lot of municipalities are already starting to warn their population. There was a announcement that went out in Chicago saying, yeah, I know you like to have snow removal. Don't count on it in this winter. We're not going to be able to afford much of it. So that could be fun.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, I have one question that's tied to the fact that you're in the Husker state, or at least digitally you are. that's tied to college football. So I'll cue that up in a second. But I also want to ask, as far as industries, you kind of went into the pain points internationally, but what benefits or opportunities do you see in certain industries that you see bubbling up, other than Zoom, obviously?
Yeah, exactly. Well, probably the two biggest beneficiaries, if that's the right way to put it, would be the medical sector, because if we're going to prepare for something like this in the future, and we know we're going to get hit by something like this again, we now have sort of the warning shot. You know, you weren't ready. You didn't have testing. You didn't have tracking. You didn't have enough medical facilities. One of the countries that has come out of this in really good shape has been Germany. And Germany has had a very low rate of fatality, and that's because they tended to overbuild when it came to the medical sector. They were talking last year about how many hospitals they could shut down because they felt like they had too many of them. Now they're going, oh, we are so glad we did not shut down those hospitals. You know, we've needed them, and it's kept our fatality rate down. The other area, of course, is anything that's related to how we now will be working and shopping. If the consumer is not anxious to go back into the retail operation, it means they're going to be doing more of their shopping online. Anyone who's involved in the parcel transportation business has probably been very happy. I mean, I look out my window now and I think I live in a parking lot for FedEx and UPS. I mean, every 20 seconds there's another one going down the road. We're going to see a lot more orientation towards working from home. Now that people have tried it, they're like, well, this isn't too bad. Maybe I would do more of this, which is going to affect the demand for office space. It also is affecting where people can live. And this could be one of those things that benefit communities like Fremont. I have already heard a lot of people saying, well, look, if I can work from home, then that means I don't have to work very close to where I live. And what my options are in my city are kind of limited. You know, the houses are expensive and the land is expensive, and I'm wasting time on commuting. I could actually live 2 hours away. I could live 3 hours away. I mean, my stepson is moving to a farm 2 hours south of Kansas City. He says, look, we do our work remotely. We don't need to be in an office. And you could suddenly have a lot of people in Omaha saying, why am I putting up with this? Fremont's a cool little town, and it's not congested, and property prices aren't as bad. And, you know, I mean, you're going to see particularly those communities that surround big cities, the Chicagos and the Detroits and the New Yorks of the world.
All right. I have a question from Nathan. Nathan says, let's get to what's really important here. And will there be a college football season this year?
You know, one of the things that we have learned is how important sports is to the overall economy of the country. And the sense at this point is that there is going to be a return of the sporting world, but there's a lot of conversation about performing without fans and restricting the number of people who are actually physically present for the game. That is going to be a little easier to pull off with professional sports than college. There's going to be a lot of people saying, do you understand what Saturday football weekend means? You know, it's not the same to tailgate in my den. You know, I mean, it just lacks a little something. I know the dog is enthusiastic about it, but you know, where are my friends? Right now, most of the institutions are not calling it yet, but you are starting to see some of the universities around the country saying, we're not going to bring back live classes, we're going to do things remotely. If they make that decision, it's also going to affect what they do with live sports. The Germans have started back up in terms of their football season, but they're doing it without fans, and they're doing it remotely. But that's not that different. I mean, I remember being in Munich a few years ago when Bayern Munich was playing the critical game for the season, and the stadium, of course, was full. But downtown Munich had 90,000 people in the square watching it on screens. So it is not out of the realm of possibility that you can have a game without a crowd. However, you're also not going to want 90,000 people packing into the square in the middle of the city watching the game either. So it's going to be a matter of whether or not people can be satisfied with watching it. The sports, professional sports, are well aware that 98% of their viewers are not live. So they're like, it's not going to be any different from the person who watches football on a Sunday. They've watched it on TV for years. This will be no different. How will the players react? It's like they score a touchdown and you hear nothing. It's kind of like, it's like, well, I've been working all year on my dance and nobody cares. So.
All right, so we're down to the final question. The question comes from Facebook Live. How has the home mortgage loan market been affected by COVID, and what is the future outlook?
So far, there has not been a huge impact. The banks have indicated that things are about normal. People are still looking in terms of buying homes. They are looking in different areas. They're looking at different kinds of homes, and probably the most encouraging thing, at least from the home builders at this stage, is this newfound interest on the part of millennials. They've been worried about that for years because that generation had not been interested in home buying. Now there's more interest. And I think part of that goes back to, we have all learned in the last 2 months to nest. I mean, if your house has been inadequate, you could kind of ignore it before because you could go out and do stuff. Now it's like, I never leave this place, so it had better be more appropriate for my needs. And that it has certainly stimulated home remodeling, and it will probably affect what kind of houses and where people buy them.
Well, Chris, you've done us a great service here in 1 hour. You've given us very detailed information, and it looks like even our own current mayor, Getchman, commented on Facebook Live and said this is great information and gives us a lot to think about. So we want to thank all of the listeners and our investors for Greater Fremont Development Council. And we also want to thank you, Chris, and Armada Intelligence, Armada Corporate Intelligence. Let me make sure I say that correctly.
It's an oxymoron, that's okay.
We look forward to maybe listening to you in the future, maybe with some updates that are positive and,
yes.
and exciting. So any final words to the group before you
No, I think we're going to find out a lot about what the recovery is going to look like in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So we're kind of in the critical month. If we're going to get a May rebound, we're going to see it in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and hopefully we're on track. And by the end of the summer, we're kind of looking back on this as like, wow, that was bizarre. Let's not do that again. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.